Listen to the good news of Christ as proclaimed in the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 10, beginning at verse 11. Glory to Christ. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. This is the gospel of Christ. Praise to Christ our Lord. Please be seated. I want to greet those at home and want to apologize again that you received the message so late last week. It was technology. Let me be honest. It was technology. When you receive a word from YouTube that it cannot upload your stuff, then we struggled. And I want to thank Jano for struggling until about 12 on Sunday evening in order to upload that sermon for us. So I want to greet those at home and say to them that today's reading was from Psalm 23, the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 4, verse 5 to 12, the first letter of John, chapter 3, verse 16 to 24, and then from the Gospel, John 10, verse 11 to 18. The gospel reading and the psalm engages us with the shepherd. The Acts of the Apostles and the reading from John reminds us what life is like with the shepherd, I think. An old commentary that I have on my shelf about the Psalms, it's so old, it's falling apart. But the contribution of Psalm 23 in that commentary states that the whole image of a pasture and water running is not what Israel presented at the time, not even now. Israel and Palestine is a rain-starved country. So what you see as green pastures in the mind of the psalmist are the trickles of green against the hills where the shepherds used to take their flock. And the stream must have been a trickling of water. But the commentator says the message that the writer of the psalm wants to bring to us, David, wants to bring to us, is that when the shepherd is present, there is always enough. Whether it is just these little pieces of green where the sheep could eat, this little stream where they could rest, when the shepherd is present, everything is enough. And so out of that example of David and out of his own life, David discovers that with God, grace is always enough. Paul speaks of grace as always being sufficient. He doesn't say it is more or that it is less. He says it's exactly what I needed. That's what David says. David says when you walk with the shepherd, you don't get more, you don't get less, you get exactly what you need. Pasture and water. And so it is to that conversation and that relationship that God invites us as His church and as a community. That He brings us to these places. And when you look at it from a distance, it looks sparse and you wonder, is this going to be enough? And then you discover when the shepherd is present, it is always enough. To that God invites us as a community and as a people, and that's the message we need to carry with our lives, that in God's presence and in the company of the shepherd, things are always enough, I think. Jesus takes that image and says, I am that shepherd. In John's Gospel, we have a number of these, what commentators speak of as the I am sayings. I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the good shepherd. I am the vine, you are the branches. And it takes us back to Moses, when Moses asked God, who are you? And God says, I am who I am. And so New Testament commentators take that as saying that Jesus is saying, I am that one. And the amazing image of that is that Moses was a shepherd. When he heard the voice of God calling from the burning bush, he was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. And David is the shepherd who becomes the king. And so it's out of these images that Jesus speaks of the shepherd. He's the shepherd who sets free. The concern that Jesus has in the story when it relates it about the shepherd, his concern is about those who are thieves and robbers. And one commentator says that God is always busy fighting that which come against us. That the cross remains the symbol of God's victory over evil and destruction, over chaos and disorder, over darkness. The cross and resurrection is God's signs of victory, that darkness is never greater than light. That chaos cannot remain when God calls order. And it is this image that Jesus has. He says, there's always these who try to create chaos and disorder. And he calls them thieves and robbers. And he says, and you will know them, because they will not enter by the gate. They will try and enter from a different place. And it is true. Don't know about you, but the devil has always attacked me when I am at my most vulnerable. It always comes with temptations of the things that he knows I want, but may not need. So Jesus says, watch out for them. These thieves and robbers who come through a different way. The shepherd is concerned about the well-being of his sheep. Therefore, he warns them against the thieves and the robbers. But he also rests with this assurance that I know my sheep and my sheep know me. He comes with the assurance of how important the sheep is to him, how important they are to him, by saying, and for them, I lay down my life. My brother used to say, Lionel used to say, he's the funniest one in the family, that the only one that he would lay his life down for is, so he's sitting and he says, between Mom and Aggie, who would you lay your life down for? And then he waits for the answer, you see. So I thought, let me put the question right back at him. And I said, who would you lay your life down for? And he says, for Mom, of course. I can always find another wife, but I cannot find another mother. Aggie just looked at me. I still haven't answered that question. But that's, I don't think, let me speak for myself, I don't think that I can fully grasp, that I will ever be able to fully grasp the depth of God's love for me. Because it continues to amaze me. And it continues to amaze us. Paul says, I pray, he says to the Ephesians, I pray that you may understand the depth and the width and the wideness of God's love for you. I pray that you may understand it. And because Paul knows it's beyond understanding, how can you ever understand that someone would lay down his life for those who did not deserve it? And yet he does it. That's what Jesus speaks of. He's the shepherd that takes care not only of those who are safe. He goes in search of the lost. So Luke tells us in his gospel. When Jesus says, and who among you who might have 100 sheep will not leave the 99 and go in search of the one that is lost? In fact, he's trying to say to the Pharisees and the scribes of that day, I'll do it. I will go in search of the lost. And at the conclusion of the story of Zacchaeus, he says, and that's why the Son of Man came, to seek and to save those who are lost. So the shepherd continues to save. And the story about Peter and the healing, it is an amazing story. You must read that. It's the only story in the Bible about one person that captures 2 chapters. Chapter 3 and chapter 4 of the Acts of the Apostles is about this man who was sitting at the gate crippled, and Peter and John healed him. And then there's this whole thing about before the Sanhedrin and told not to do this and told not to do that. But this man's healing captures 2 chapters in the Acts of the Apostles. And I think that what happens when you're in the company of the shepherd, you begin to engage with the acts of the shepherd. You seek for ways to save those who are being lost. You look for opportunities to lift those who are down. You look for moments to speak a kind word to those who have experienced the rough parts of life. You search for a place where people can find water for those whose lives are running dry. You engage with the shepherd in his acts of restoring and renewing and bringing redemption and salvation. You engage with that. Peter says, we have engaged with that. Therefore, in his name, we have healed this man. And John says, worship to his readers. John says, worship is not a passive act. Worship is doing, is getting and moving into action. And therefore, in one moment, I regretted the story of not paying tribute to Priscilla last week, but I think her life fits today's sermon. That she discovered that worship is not a passive act, but you go out of the sanctuary and you look and you see there are people standing, let me do something about it. That's what the gospel does. You engage with the shepherd in his work of restoring and renewing and saving. There was an amazing group, and we were all invited. I only did that one evening, and then because it was in winter. In winter in Johannesburg, in town, is in the city center, is not wonderful because those high buildings keep the sun away, not only during the day, even at night. It's freezing cold because the sun is not there during the day, and at night you receive it. But there was a group. They called themselves Pabalo Yabatu. And they used to walk on a Wednesday evening. They even engaged, it's a church group. They even engaged the medical students from Wits University. And they would walk the streets on a Wednesday evening, two of them carrying pots of soup, others carrying bread. And the medical students, with the medical students, they went to everyone that they could find who slept on the street. Gave them soup, gave them bread, and the medical students attended to the wounds. And others followed with blankets in winter to keep them warm. And when I read that story, I thought, that's what it means to engage with the shepherd. You seek the lost. You bind the wounds. You feed the hungry. And you lift up the fallen. Because right at the end of that group, as they walked with food and bread, and so right at the end was someone who comes along and then read the scriptures. So that people could understand this is not just an act of charity, but it's a demand of the gospel. And many of those who lived on the streets, and you remember those days when they slept in the entrances to the shop and the malls. Many of those were served by those who cleaned their wounds. And I always thought that's an amazing thing to do. To walk with the buckets of water and cloths and clean wounds, and then the students would put on whatever is needed and dress the wounds. And this is the amazing thing. Every Wednesday, people waited for that group to pass. Every Wednesday, they waited. Because something about it was to walk in the company of the shepherd. I think as we continue our life with the shepherd who says, I lay down my life, but I will take it back again. As we walk, that we will continue our efforts to seek for ways to renew God's word and constantly discover for ourselves what it means to walk in the company of the shepherd. And as we walk, that we will discover that where he leads us, there is enough. May God bless us. And may God keep us in the warmth of his love. Amen.